Yeah, we're gonna warm him up and then go to existentials in general and see how it goes. Okay. Is it cold in here, or am I just like at bad circulation?
It's a little chilly.
It's exciting. Oh, he forgot his phone. Oh no, he's recording. I forgot. No.
What do you do?
I sent it to the items and it's not done to
There's this girl, and she's like, yeah, I think I hate that. I was like, so excited. And she came in, and she was like, yeah, you know, I tried to take off Kinsey.
Yeah.
I cited on my paper a personal interview with a guy.
Yeah.
I didn't have his last name. Is that okay? I just left it out.
Yeah, if you didn't have it.
Oh, we have to cite everyone we talked to.
Not necessarily. I mean, if it's a primary source for, like, I'm not sure what the context is specifically.
Like if I talk to and someone who's like really messed up.
I'm assuming that this is in the anthropological portion, where you're describing the situation. Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay, but if I'm getting,
Like if you were getting, if you were using an interview as source for your knowledge of Islam, like so if you got the two chunks, right? First there's anthropology, this is what happened, this is where I was, this is what color the wall was, whatever. Then you have the religion being unpacked. You definitely need to cite wherever you're getting that information from, and if that happened to be an interview, then yes.
if it wasn't the interview, but it's kind of supplemental, what I learned in this spot is supplemental.
If it's your account of the actual event itself, then that's the anthropological side.
Putting it into my book smarts part of it that I need to study.
I mean, depending on like how much of your book smarts part of it is anchored on that interview, yeah. Like if it's just incidental, then it's incidental. If it's a primary source, then yeah. You need to.
Do we need to cite your notes if we use your notes?
I would encourage other sources besides my notes, but yeah, you should.
Well, I just cited your notes for the full path.
That's fine. That's fine. That's fairly like 5 clicks on Wikipedia kind of thing. No.
Yeah, I cited it in 2 places because I used yours to get like the 3.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, that's good because that's almost like common knowledge at this point. Okay. Welcome back. So let's go ahead and dive back in with Nietzsche and understanding hegemony and understanding cultural power. We had gotten, I feel, sufficiently gotten master and slave morality on the table, and we're going to unpack that. We're going to do a warm-up lap with that, but we're also going to move into something I feel we only really got brushed up against, and that's Nietzsche's epistemology in general. So those are the big goals for the day. And then if we wrap all that up, I'm going to kind of situate Nietzsche in his own intellectual genealogy, which is a philosophical movement known as existentialism, which deals with meaning itself, or how to deal with meaning in a very Nietzschean way. So, as we recall, Nietzsche was a very gifted philologist. Remember, philology is the study of the origin of language. But usually you have to pick a branch, and then you have to learn a bunch of history and culture to go along with it. So language is the focus, but the culture that's speaking the language is usually what a philologist will anchor in on. And the culture that he focused in on was ancient Greece, and therefore he worked on Greek and Latin and how it informs all of the Romantic languages. And he's to this day one of the heavyweights, one of the finest philologists of his era. If you dig far enough for the sources in a Greek or Latin philology textbook, I'd say you have an 80% chance of finding Nietzsche. So before he became Nietzsche, the controversial philosopher, he was Nietzsche, the great philologist. Things got weird, however. Incredibly talented. He had, as I mentioned, the grad student dream. He got to just skip over the dissertation and go straight to teaching. At the age of 24, he was given a doctorate and started teaching at the University of Basel. All of his papers were published in globally recognized journals. As soon as he wrote them, he was just off the track. But what got odd, or where it started, as soon as he started his professorship and he started really digging into his source material, it became evident that it was going to get very complicated and very strange because arguably he was one of the first scholars to actually understand what he was reading. That is, that he, in great depth, understood that the ancient Greeks were talking about an entirely different world than the world that he was in. And so he became the first bridge for us in the modern era to understand not only the difference between modern, and by that I mean everything past 1492, modern European culture and ancient culture, but in ancient Greek culture. But in exploring that, he started to realize features of culture itself and the constructed nature of knowledge and morality and all of these things. So he opened up doors for sociology, radical advances in anthropology, even provided the space for Freud later on, psychology, philosophy, cultural theory in general. He pretty much defined the field. And he's fairly unique in the world of thinkers, not just European, but Indic, Chinese, everywhere. Nietzsche really stands out. He had a kind of a sad life. He was a workaholic, worked around the clock, and as a consequence of both fairly inadequate medical care and a fairly reckless life, he just lived a life that resulted in increasing amounts of physical pain, and eventually went mad and died, kind of misunderstood and alone. He wrote many books. I think last count, it's like it depends on how you want to look at it. Like there are manuscripts that got turned into books after the fact, and letters and collections of letters got turned into books after the fact. But if you just look at the books he wrote, I think it's in the neighborhood of 28 or 30. For our conversation, I wanted to focus on just 6. Birth of Tragedy, which is his first major publication once he had attained his professorship. And here he's talking about Greek tragic theater. The reason why he's fascinated with it is because one of the first things that he noticed about the Greeks was that they could do theater better than anything that was happening in Europe at the time, and quite frankly, to this day. Now, of course, Shakespeare could write tragedy, but nobody was doing things like the Greeks. They also had comedies. They had they celebrated all expressions of human interaction and human society, which is something that was absent in medieval theater. So he became fascinated with that, and then he worked on to genealogy and morals. I just want to take a moment to talk about the Greek that he works on in Twilight of the Idols, and then we have 2 really big ones, Thus Spoke Zarathustra and The Gay Science, which are both dealing with the same issue, and then the real hammer comes down with The Will to Power. So, while he was reading the Greeks, and again for clarity, this is the ancient Greeks, not the people that are living in Greece at the moment. In Birth of the Tragedy, Nietzsche argued that the ancient Greeks had 2 features of their culture that we needed to recognize. And he called these 2 features the Dionysian and the Apollonian, after the gods Dionysus and Apollo, respectively. So Dionysus is the god of drunkenness, wine, debauchery. And Apollo is the god of truth, capital T, truth, science, and art. And the humanities in general. And what Nietzsche concluded was that we have only been, everything we took from the Greeks and that we've been working with, or at least from in his time, was Apollonian, and we had completely denied and ignored the Dionysian. And this was more than just a type of clerical error. This is something that resulted in a cultural sense of self that he found very problematic. So he asserted that these 2 deities that the Greeks had celebrated were expressions of the human condition, and that modern European society, or the European society in which he was situated, had lost its Dionysian element and focused only on the Apollonian. And this was the central problem. This is what sent him down the path that would turn him into Nietzsche. He, after the Birth of the Tragedy, commonly referred to himself as the Dionysian, and you will see him refer to himself that way. It gets really confusing as he goes crazy towards the end, because you're not sure what he means. But if you understand that he's referring to himself as the Dionysian, then that helps a little bit. So by losing the Dionysian, we had lost our understanding of our inherent animal natures. And animal natures is very loaded here because we have a negative connotation for that. But that's exactly Nietzsche's point. He's like, no, you are an animal. There's a part of you that is animalistic. And you've got to get over your anxiety about it, because you are denying who you are. So you can't have the Apollonian without the Dionysian. If you try, you will only suppress this animal nature and thus make it worse, make it stronger, make it fester. That is, that you will, if you repress this part of yourself, it will only explode in your face. And using this suppression of the Dionysian element, Nietzsche says this is being used to control people through shame and loathing. I make you hate part of yourself. I make you ashamed of part of yourself. I make you hide part of yourself. And when you hide part of yourself, that part of yourself will eventually escape. It will explode. And when it explodes, then I can say, oh look, there's that animal, and thus punish you for being what you are. And that's one of the things that we're going to try to explore a little bit more today. We'd also forgotten satire. Like at that point, there were no funny plays. Satire didn't exist in late to medieval Victorian Europe. We had also lost the catharsis of tragedy. Tragedy is not fun, but it is important. You need to be in touch with the tragic because it exists, and if you ignore it, it's going to be all the more overwhelming when it rears its ugly head. So we've been conditioned into suppressing ourselves and denying a very large portion of human nature, or what we are. But most importantly for Nietzsche, we have forgotten the thrill of being alive. We have sterilized ourselves, and in sterilizing ourselves, we have lost ourselves. So the example I had given during the break, or before the break, is if you received if you went to a sex ed class, and they didn't mention in the sex ed class that sex feels awesome, you were subjected to the Apollonian, and you were denied the Dionysian. That is the animal part of you that enjoys having sex. Is shame. Like look at it. Like I can cut off somebody's head with a chainsaw on television. That's fine. But if I show a woman's nipple, the show gets canceled. Nietzsche's going to say that right there. There's nothing wrong with being happy about bodies and sex and all that stuff. But when I deny it, then it gets weird. So when you deny this aspect of humanities, individuals and societies lose something incredibly, fundamentally valuable. This is why Europe, as Nietzsche saw it, was incapable of creating great art, or at least art to the magnitude of what he saw in the ancient Greeks. And to be fair, very little of what that chapter of European history did is going to stand the test of time, or doesn't seem to be able to stand the test of time, that the Greeks already have.
Yeah, that seems a lot like the Vulcan planet, actually, because they're all trying to be very logical.
Well, the Vulcans are Apollonian and denying the Dionysian, and when we see, for example, in the rebooting of Star Trek, when Spock, who's half human, explodes, the reason he explodes from a Nietzschean point of view is because he's suppressing his humanity. Whereas Captain Kirk is way too Dionysian and not Apollonian enough, which is why the relationship works.
Why do you think the Dionysian nature was lost?
Well, that goes into the slave morality, but it also, so from a crass philosophy of atheism point of view, the reason that the Dionysian was lost was because those in power realized that by subjecting people to shame, fear, and loathing, they're easier to control.
It's through hegemony.
Yeah, hegemony. It's hegemonically profitable. Although that's a little bit later down the line, but yeah, that's where we're headed. Yes, ma'am.
So going back to the example you had about like TV, nudity versus like
violence.
Why isn't violence considered the Dionysian as well?
It is, but
It's more.
the violence that we see, like when I put a chainsaw through somebody's head, that's hate, that's loathing. Whereas lust is not hate. So the only expression of the animal that I'm permitted is hate. And he's like, well, hate's, it's in there, but hate without love, that's dangerous. Hate without love turns people into monsters. And then once they express this monster, then I can say, oh look, he's a monster, and treat him like a monster, or her, as the case may be. Right? So from this point on, Nietzsche refers to himself as Dionysian with this in mind. It's also important to recognize that while he's working on the birth of the tragedy, he starts to ask these big questions that we're used to now. But it's important to recognize he's the first person to ever ask, where does morality come from? And remember, in context of our conversation before the break for Thanksgiving, I had situated Nietzsche after Kant. So Kant had liberated us from absolutes, liberated us from the prison of absolutism, which we're still kind of sort of in. And Nietzsche's like, well, if there is no absolute good and absolute bad, then where does this conversation come from? And this is where we get to our next major work, The Genealogy of Morals, where he asks the question of, right, when up until Nietzsche, when you saw an Inuit tribe, or African, or Chinese, anything other than Europe that had a different morality system, you just thought that they were wrong, and that your morality was obviously the only correct moral system. And Nietzsche said, I don't think, number one, that our moral system is that great. And number two, it looks like it's just an accident of history. If you were born Chinese, that's what you would think is the moral way. And you just happen to be born in Europe, so that's why you think that. So in the genealogy of morals, he is going to ask these questions. So where do moral codes come from? If there are no absolutes, if Kant was right, which arguably he is, what drives the development of morality? And this opens the door for hegemony, because he's going to say, well, what drives morality is whatever's useful.
Just to be clear, can you define genealogy?
A genealogy means like an ancestral link. So in humans, your genealogy would be your grandfather,
Okay.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So like, where did this idea originate? So like, say we live in an Inuit culture, and in Inuit culture, Eskimos, infanticide, killing a baby, is permissible if the baby is under, like, say there's the deformity or something that's going to prohibit the baby from being able to contribute towards hunting and building stuff. Because the calorie balance in an Eskimo tribe is such that if you have somebody that isn't bringing calories into the community, then it's going to starve everybody. So before Nietzsche, if you saw an Eskimo killing a baby, you'd be like, that's just horribly wrong, period. After Nietzsche, you say, well, why are they doing that? And then you go back and ask, okay, where did this start? And people started to realize that caring for deformed children was something that community didn't have the luxury of doing. And so that would be the genealogy of morals. Looking back at, like, what's the circumstances that built this? Okay. Good question. So Nietzsche is really like, this has become commonplace. You don't really take critical theory without this assumption in place. But Nietzsche's the guy that did this. He recognized that morals, or he argued that morals are constructed and historical and explainable by observable forces in the world. Why did they kill the babies? Like, I could answer that question by saying, they're evil. Or I could say, well, let's look at where they are.
There must be a reason.
There's got to be a reason, right? So and again, in the history of thinkers across the planet, Nietzsche really, like, after him, everybody jumped on board. But really, he's the first person in history that I know of that actually started to ask these kinds of questions, which makes him kind of stand out. Because you see parallels in logic, you see parallels in ethics, you see people reaching a lot of the same conclusions, but Nietzsche's one of the first people to go, hey, wait a minute. And this also opens the door for existentialism in general, because he's just following through on what Kant is going to offer us, and that is the suggestion that we're literally making things up.
So where did the morals against gay marriage come from? Like, probably a lot from the Bible, but like, why is it in the Bible?
Because it's a useful way for controlling a large portion of the population. If I can make you, first, I cut genders. Women are inferior. Now I've got 50% of the community under my thumb. Now, maybe I don't like the color of your skin. I've got another community. Maybe I don't like your sexual orientation because it's different than the guy who's writing the book. Now you're under my thumb. Yeah. So again, whatever is useful. So that's all the backdrop. Now let's put Nietzsche in his own place, 19th century Europe. He's actually right on the cusp of the 20th century. He died in 1900. But Nietzsche was overwhelming. Like, after he got to this point, and remember, right around the birth of the genealogy of morals, he's still a functional professor. But right about this point, he starts kind of breaking away from everybody, saying, whoa, I think there's something fundamentally wrong here. Like, that what we're doing in Europe, our culture, is to the core messed up. So he's going to say, look, the moral code that we are following in Europe at the time came from a very specific set of reasons. And he said, okay, I'm going to set myself the task of uncovering how we got into this position. And this is where the religion bit gets into it. And this is where he develops his notion of slavin moral, or the slave morality. So the slave morality had a specific history. which we looked at before the break, but we'll warm ourselves up to it so we can remember. But Nietzsche set himself the task of uncovering where this slave morality had come from, and also clarifying why it's a problem, why this morality is the chief obstacle towards human progress from his point of view. To give you the simplest sketch, just before we dive in, it's this slave morality is the principal method for controlling the masses through suppressing the Dionysian. I teach you to be ashamed of yourself by telling you that part of what you naturally are is wrong, original sin. You're so bad, you made God kill himself. Christianity in a nutshell. From Nietzsche. So, again, to warm us up, master morality is the morality of the strong-willed, the morality that will organically present itself in a community of people who have the ability to affect the results of their actions. If you can control the consequences of your actions, then that's where you're going to base your morality. So what is good is what's helpful, what is bad is what's harmful, assuming that you have control of those factors. So it's a morality based off of consequence. The inverse of that is slave morality, and slave morality comes from people who don't have control over the results of their actions. Slaves don't have a choice about going and picking cotton today. So they're going to base their morality somewhere else. It's an inversion and a reaction to master morality. So it's going to say consequences don't matter. It's intentions that matter. And you still see this argument anytime you get into a good ethical argument. Like, it's the difference between manslaughter and first-degree murder. Did you intend to kill somebody, or did you kill somebody? Nietzsche would say, we just need to look at whether or not you killed somebody.
So, in Nietzsche's mind, what is the better morality? Is it
Master morality. Master morality. That's where.
So he believes that everyone should have master morality, and everyone should be concerned about.
Well, what he's going to do is he's going to say we're stuck, and we'll unpack exactly how. But we're stuck in this situation where the slave morality is prohibiting master morality from even existing, because slave morality is a response to master morality. If anybody tries to take charge of their life, if anybody tries to have a direct line between their actions and the consequences of those actions, regardless of what the consequences are, that's wrong, right? So Nietzsche's like, we need to pierce through that, and then once we have, then we can evaluate whether your actions are good or bad, because you have control over the consequences. So you're not, it's not like everybody gets a free ticket. But what he's going to argue for is you need to base your morality off of the results of your actions and recognize that you are responsible for that. Because right now that you have had that stolen from you by being told that you're the victim of heaven and hell and sin and all this other stuff.
Okay, so using the, like, if I give you $1 million and you use the $1 million to what?
Make a crack house.
Yeah. Then it's amoral of you to give money to people because they might build crack houses?
No, it's amoral of me to give money to somebody who turns that money into something wrong.
Okay.
Because I'm responsible for that. Okay, so if we went with an intentional based ethics, the example we're using is if I give somebody $1 million and that person uses $1 million to go turn Longmont to a crack house, or $6 million, or however much it would cost to turn Longmont to a crack house. Actually, probably about 50 bucks. If you turned it into Longmont to a crack house, and I said, well, my intention was good, I just wanted to give you some money, Nietzsche would say, I'm pretty sure you've got eyes and ears, so look at her and decide what's going to happen when you give her the money, because I'm responsible for that. So if I give the money to somebody who's demonstrated affinity for crack, then I'm responsible for them turning Longmont to a crack house.
So you're saying that's like the slave morality side, and the master morality would be like...
Can you give me a little bit more, like when I say that?
What you just said, like about...
If I held myself responsible for turning Longmont into a crack house because I know that she has an affinity for crack, that's master morality.
Can we just put it down that I do not for crack?
We'll just leave it as an open question, because I mean, maybe not now, but later down the line, you never know.
I don't mean to be this person, but
Be
what
that.
if you couldn't tell? What if they tricked you
The reason you don't know is because, you haven't experienced sophrosia or agonia, which is where we're going to get to in just a minute. But you should know your limits.
No.
Oh.
What if you can't tell the person you're talking to is a crackhead?
Then you shouldn't give them money until you know.
So if they just look completely respectful, like
Mhm.
whatever that looks like, and then they just secretly turn, like if their intentions were secret.
If they are masterfully deceitful, then you aren't responsible because they were masterfully deceitful. And what you will learn.
Because I feel like that scenario is way more popular.
What's that?
Being deceived by somebody. So you're
Well, this matrix of deception is a consequence for Nietzsche of us losing the skill of sophrosia, which we will unpack shortly. But if we all truly knew ourselves as the ancient Greeks knew themselves, that would solve a lot of the problems, which is one of the reasons why the Greeks were so hyper-competitive, because they were constantly trying to determine their sophrosia. They're trying to figure out who they are. Who's the liars?
So in this, knowing yourself is knowing that you are able to differentiate between a crackhead and a person who will spend money
Right.
wisely.
Right. So like say you look like a perfectly upstanding citizen and I give you money and you deceived me. Well, that's where I learn that sometimes people that look perfectly acceptable are crackheads. And thus I become more knowledgeable of myself and of crackheads.
So I might be off here, but are you saying that like in ancient Greece, with sophrosia, they could they didn't have to learn that lesson?
Well, those who were well skilled, like there's going to be like, it's not like everybody was a master of sophrosia,
Yeah.
but at least it was part of the conversation. So that if you tried to pull one over on Socrates, he'd tear you apart. If you tried to take one on Epicurus or the Stoics or the Skeptics or any of the rich philosophical conversation that is completely missing in the European conversation, he'd say, well, the reason that they had that was because the reason they were creating great art, the reason they were creating great thought, the reason they were creating great theater is because they understood the Dionysian and how to get to it. Good questions, everybody. So this slave morality is this weird self-loathing thing, or this focusing only on intentions and giving up your responsibility of consequences, is a poison of the mind because it denies your Dionysian element. So the animal side of you wants to control, and again, animals loaded even today, it sounds negative, but he's just saying, look, the fire in your heart wants to control its own destiny. And when you deny that fire in your heart, it turns into a dark pit. It warps and it festers. And by teaching people to be ashamed of themselves, by teaching people to deny their Dionysian, I'm poisoning their minds. So it becomes a self-justifying pattern as the dark side becomes stronger, and when it eventually comes out, it confirms your deepest fears about it. This is one of I spend a fair amount of energy and time looking at gender, and one of the dynamics in gender is that men are incredibly emotionally suppressed. Men are incredibly emotionally retarded. That is to say that generally, if you talk to a man over the age of 12, even if he's 40, he has the emotional repertoire of a 12-year-old. And thus, you can't even begin to talk to that person about their emotions because why? They'll blow up at you. Why did you damn kids fuck up? That's the problem. They don't have an emotional toolbox to deal with their Dionysian. And the more I don't talk about it, the worse the problem gets. So you treat people like dumb animals, and then you act surprised when they lash out like dumb animals. I used this example last time we talked about it, but I can't not think about it. I grew up in the South, and in the South, the schools, like the high school that I went to, had barbed wire fence around the top. It was identical to a prison. And we acted like thugs. I go to Colorado, you had to wear a uniform, you couldn't wear a hat, you couldn't use a skateboard, you couldn't take a skateboard to school because a skateboard could be used as a weapon, and if we had one, we would use it as a weapon. Kids in Colorado are walking around with hats and doing whatever they want. Like I saw two boys in the age range of, I'd say, like 9 or 10, walking through the playground, just nonchalantly holding each other's hands as they went. And I was like, yeah, that's awesome. When I was a kid, no, not even close. But if you treat them like little agents that can control themselves. What do you know? They act like little agents that can control themselves. If you treat them like horrific criminals waiting to commit a crime, guess what? They act like crime. They become criminals. So Nietzsche was ahead of the game on that. So our natures are not to be slaves. Not to be in the slave morality, but to be both Dionysian and Apollonian. So don't totally be an animal. You need to get all your culture and logic and all that stuff, all your science and all the great things that humans can do. You need to do that too. I can see your tonsils. Yeah. But you also have an animal nature too. So when we suppress our Dionysian characteristics, or we suppress our Dionysian characteristics because using them involves passion. And exploring your passions often involves suffering. If you want to find out if you're a great artist, even if you are a great artist, it's going to hurt to find out. There's going to be a lot of painful lessons. And rather than explore those painful lessons, we just adopt lives of mediocrity. So the difference between the master and the student is that the master has failed more times than the student has tried. You have to be willing to fall down. And we are so scared of falling down that we never get up. Or at least that's the end result of this whole conversation for Nietzsche. So suffering is not inherently bad. I mean, it's not fun, but it's part of being a human being. It's how you learn, and it gives you this special type of knowledge that Nietzsche is all excited about, that I introduced to you last week, and that is Sophrosny. Again, I apologize for my horrific phonetic. I've never seen it phonetically spelled in English, so I just gave it my best shot. I've only seen it in the Greek. But Sophrosny is translated as know thyself, which doesn't do it justice because we're very like when we say know, we just mean knowledge, just all knowledge, and this is a special type of knowledge, and a knowledge only you can have about yourself. And it comes through fearlessly finding your own limits. But we, because we're subjected to this slave morality, are afraid to look at our limits. So Nietzsche also argued, he said, well, look at the Greeks, man. These guys, there wasn't a day of the week that they weren't doing, like the Olympics. They came up with that, right? So there's no shame in being the very... It makes no difference if you're the fastest runner or the slowest runner. The only thing that you should be ashamed of is whether or not you don't know how fast of a runner you are. You have to find your limit and then see the beauty in that limit. The only true shame for Nietzsche is in not having the courage to step up to the plate and find out who you are. So this is all in Twilight of the Idols, where he explores just the language of it. This book was overlooked a lot because it's just pure linguistic geekery. But if you give it time, he'll give you a couple of terms that are very useful for understanding the rest of his work. So Sophrosny is one of them, and then agonia, which is the root that we have for agony, is the other word. And like Sophrosny, the emphasis in agonia is that everyone must struggle, because this is the principle with which you learn. And you're going to suffer, period. Welcome to life. You're going to suffer. If you suffer without learning, that is a waste. You're just throwing it away. You're just basically throwing yourself in front of the fire for no reason at all. Nietzsche also, as we touched on last week, was opposed to anything that would numb pain, but for him specifically, alcohol. It's like a fantastic expression of our lack of understanding Sophrosny and agonia is our addiction to numbing ourselves. I spent a long time as a bartender, and I noticed that conversations come in three flavors. First, people parrot movies and jokes or songs. Like they're not even talking, they're just repeating other things that people said, which is weird. Second, they're talking about how they secretly hate their friends. I love Susie, but, and I'm always just like, there it is. And then the third, the weirdest thing that I see drunk people do, or used to see drunk people do, is talk about horrific things that they've done, or horrific things that are happening, but frame it as if it's a big, like, I had just barfed all over myself, right? And the cop comes in, and he's like, is that my daughter? And I'm like, if you told that story without laughing, it would be tragic. If you were like, yeah, so then I vomited all over myself, and then the police came in. That's a story you don't have the courage to say, but you need to say it. So you're saying it loudly in a bar, because that animal needs to get out. And Nietzsche would say, hey, how about you just skip the booze, look yourself in the mirror and say that. Also, if you skip the booze, you probably wouldn't have barfed on the sheriff's daughter. So as master morality originates in the strong, slave morality originates in the weak. And because slave morality is a reaction to the master, it villainizes master morality right off the cuff. Like anybody who dares to talk about the things that Nietzsche is talking about will instantly ruffle feathers. From a later point of view, that's because he's challenging hegemony. But from his point of view, it's because I'm challenging the slave morality. I'm challenging the genealogy of our moral code. So Nietzsche saw the morality of his entire culture as fundamentally wrong and oppressive to the human animal. It punishes you for being what you are, and then when you react to the punishment, it uses your reaction to justify further punishment. It's just a vicious cycle of fear and loathing. So this culminates in Nietzsche's, this is where we ended last time, this culminates in Nietzsche's critique of Christianity and religion in general. Religion is not about morality at all for Nietzsche. Religion is about power. That's what this moral code does. It doesn't actually make people moral, it makes them obedient. And the example that I had given you was, if we look today, Pat Robinson, wealthiest evangelical Christian in the world, has done next to nothing to help anybody, donated 5% of his income, uses slave labor, whereas the next, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates are too wealthy. Bill Gates being one of the wealthiest people on earth, donating over $26 billion to charity. By some estimates, having saved over 6 million lives so far. He's about to start an investment, I don't know if you guys have heard about it, but he's doing global renewable energy because he says that climate change has gotten so bad that we're at what Pope Francis recently called, I think this morning, the suicide moment, that if we don't act now, it's going to just be the end of it for us. And so Bill Gates is going to bankroll it, going to bankroll the renewable resource initiative, but this man has devoted his life to Jesus Christ. Both of these men are atheists. Ergo, he's going to heaven. No matter how good Bill is, he's going to hell. Why? Because when we look back at the Bible and we see Abraham willing to kill his son Isaac because God told him to, the lesson there for Nietzsche is that this religion is not about morality. This religion is about obedience. If you jump when I say jump, then you win. Doesn't matter where you jumped or why you jumped, just that you jumped. And that's why he's the patron saint from Nietzsche's point of view. Alright. So let's move to our next set of texts. This is where it gets a little bit challenging, at least as far as epistemology. This is where he critiques science as well. So thus spoke Zarathustra, and the gay science are his attempts to use the same deconstruction that he used on religion on epistemology, or knowledge itself. So in the gay science, he looks at knowledge as an instrument of power, and in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is a very difficult book, he looks at the consequences. He thought Thus Spoke Zarathustra was the greatest thing he ever wrote, and then he actually said 1,000 years from now, this will become the new Bible. Which is ironic considering his opinion of the Bible. But yeah, he thought that this was, he's like, this is it, I'm done. This is the best book. Of course, he kept writing anyways. But it's a really, I don't mean to be blunt, but it's a weird book. Like there's a guy walking on a tightrope, and then the devil shows up and pushes him off, and the guy falls on the ground, and he's like, I'm dying. And Zarathustra walks up and says, it doesn't matter, because when you're dead, you just don't exist anymore. And the guy dies, and then he carries the corpse around with him, and I'm like, what's going on? Why am I, what? So if you get into it and it makes sense to you, you'll have to explain it to me. Sir?
If this is like our highest philosophy class, do you think we could read any of his books and like?
You can read, actually, he's filtered into, like when I say morality is entirely constructed, or that your moral code depends on where you were born, you would kind of like, depending, I'd say there's a good chance you'd be like, yeah, whether you had heard of Nietzsche or not. The reason you have that is because that's filtered enough into the conversation that it makes sense to you. So I'd say you should just jump in and read Nietzsche. Nietzsche also writes, and it's called an aphoristic style. So most philosophers, like, they have a line where they're like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And Nietzsche just throws stuff at you. So like you can literally, like, human, all too human, you can just pick that book up and just read a random page. And if it hits you, great. If it doesn't, flip the page. But that said, you should be able to grab Nietzsche. Or at least give it a shot. Why not? So anyways, in Zarathustra, this is where the famous line, God is dead and we have killed him. And this is the line that I want to focus in on because this is a commonly misunderstood or a very complicated statement. So one of the crescendo of thus spoke Zarathustra is Zarathustra comes down from the mountain and says, God is dead and we have killed him. And that just, everybody's, whoa! This book, his publisher went out of business trying to sell this book, and then after the publisher went out of business, it became wildly popular. So this publisher really kind of took the blunt on that one. But yeah, this has become, I would say, you should at least try to get through this book. Zarathustra. I find the gay science a little bit because it's nice and 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm very like order. So the gay science works better for me, but both of them make the same argument.
So are all his books works of fiction that...
No. Some of them, like Birth of Tragedy, is just a straightforward. The Twilight of the Idols is just him doing linguistics, like him talking about, like, hey, I just read all this Greek stuff and look at these words and how they work. And the gay science is very like written for a philosophical audience. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is pure prose. There's a lot of letters where he was just talking to people, and people collected those letters and presented it. So it's just like him talking straight, in which he has a linear line of thought. The genealogy of morals is fairly linear, although he does go off on some tangents that I don't know why he did. I mean, they're interesting, but you're like, what's the relevance? But then if we get into his relationship with knowledge, he's incredibly dedicated to this non-absolutism. And so when Nietzsche talks to you, never look at, like, say he says A, don't look at A. Look at A in relationship to B, because that's where the truth is. So it's a little confusing because you're like, okay, I still have the problem. I'll look at A and I'll be like, I have no idea what you're doing, but you need to look at A in comparison to something else. And where those comparisons are, he's not going to be like, if he said, look at A and then B, then he's asserting. He needs you to figure it out. Right? So it's challenging in that regard. All right, so in gay science, and thus spoke Zarathustra, he's focused on the epistemology of his era. He says, okay, we got a weird situation where Europe is atheist, but still behaving like Christians. What he means by that is, and this is what the God is dead thing is after Kant rolled down the hill with his critique of pure reason, there's no going back. Like, if I went in a time machine and I talked to a peasant in the 14th century Europe and said, where are the atheists? He wouldn't even know that it was a thing. Like, what do you mean? Like there's people that don't believe, it's like not believing in gravity. Like, what? We're in an era now where even if you believe with all of your heart, you're nevertheless aware of the fact that not everybody's on board with that. And so that's what he means by we're atheistic. That is, there is an element that has changed in our meaning-making game. If you ask that 14th century peasant, why is the sky blue? They've got an answer off the top, because God likes blue. Why is grass green? Because God likes green when he's looking down. You ask somebody in modern Europe, they'll be like, well, there's refraction of light, and this is a whole different game. So that's what he means by atheist, but we're still going through the motions of Christianity. What he means by going through the motions of Christianity is we're still expecting there to be absolute things that we can count on, like God, but there's none, and so there's a problem. So while Europe is still nominally Christian, that is, they're going through the motions, Nietzsche suggests that their faith in God had been replaced by faith in science. He's like, don't do that with science, because that's not how science works. This is largely due to the fact that people didn't recognize that they're out of the prison of absolutism yet. We still have the habit of wanting something that's absolutely true. And he's like, yeah, but science ain't ever going to give you that because science doesn't work that way. If you thought Newton was absolutely true, then Einstein was really rough for you, huh? And if you think Einstein's absolutely true, then the next one down the line is going to be really rough for you. So Europe here, inappropriately impose the expectation of absolutism, that I can get capital T truth out of science. And when they do that, that means you don't understand what science is, or how it works, or what it does. In short, Nietzsche says, we've raised science to a godlike status simply out of habit. We're used to having some authority give us the answer. And then we destroyed that, or Kant and Napoleon and all that, destroyed that. And now we're like putting science up on a pedestal. And it's not that science isn't, he's a big fan of science. He's like, this is great, but you guys need to understand what's happening here. Science merely describes. It does not explain anything. It doesn't tell you why. It doesn't give you metaphysical answers. It just tells you what's happening. That's to say, science merely demonstrates causal relationships. It doesn't concern itself with ultimate causes. Like, what's the meaning of life? Science isn't going to answer that question for you. Because that's not what science just says, okay, when I put this magnet next to this magnet, this happens. Every time. When I put water on top of a flame, this happens. Every time. Why? It just does. Science doesn't enter into that philosophical conversation. So, above all, science is falsifiable. That is, the whole point of science is scientist says, I think this is the case, and then humanity spends the rest of their time trying to disprove it. And eventually they will. But this idea of a claim being falsifiable, that is not absolute, but just working up until somebody falsifies it, is something that we've never had to contend with on a mass scale. Humanity's never had to deal with that before. Humanity's never been on its own. That is, it's up to you. You go figure it out. Test it. That's brand spanking new. So take, for example, math. To this day, when I talk to mathematicians present math as if it's absolutely true. It's a feature of the universe. And they talk about it in absolute terms. Well, that is to say, the math is absolutely real, absolutely correct. It's the language of the universe, etc. But there are no absolutes in the modern world. At least Nietzsche is going to say, nope, we're out of that. Math is simply an effective tool. So, while math is remarkably effective at determining causal relationships, it is not in and of itself any more or less true than language. In fact, it is just a language. Like English is incredibly effective for all of you to get your needs met, generally speaking. Food, clothes, gas, exchange. You use it every day with a 99% effectivity rate. But English is just some arbitrary noises that you've learned to make, and some symbols. I can make those symbols and get giggles. Just because we decided, but they don't absolutely mean anything. They're just slashes on a board. Likewise, neither English nor math are absolutely true. They're just effective means for communicating ideas. So the math is like the A-B thing. I'm going to put this idea out, and I'm going to use a tool to put it out. I'm going to put this idea out, and I'm going to use a tool to get it out. But don't confuse the tools for the ideas. Languages aren't the world, they're ways of describing it. Math isn't part of the universe. It's just a very good way of describing it and navigating your way through it. So let's hop on the Nietzschean train for a second and consider the possibility that math doesn't exist.
Math might not actually exist. Love it or hate it, you can't argue the importance of math. Math, as a system, is elegant, exhaustive, and frequently even beautiful. In the words of Eugene Wigner, it is, quote, unreasonably effective when put to use in all other sciences. But in light of its beauty and effectiveness, and in spite of its importance, there is a thing you can argue about. You can argue where it comes from. Where biology is the study of living organisms, physics the study of the universe and its forces, chemistry the study of chemicals, math is the study of math. Unlike all the other sciences, math lacks an empirical component. You can't, trust me on this one, see math happening. Like, sure, if you have one WYSIWYR and you add one WYSIWYR clone,
you have two WYSIWYRs. But is this oneness a part of me? Is this two-ness a part of both of us? I like to think that I'm a part of you. And sometimes we even finish each other's. As I was saying, are these ideas features of the universe and the stuff in it? Ideas like 1, 2, parabolas, calculus, subtraction, double subtraction?
Or are they a product of the human brain in all of its genius and splendor? In other words, do people discover math or do they create math? Saying that people discover math, meaning that it exists regardless of whether or not there are people, is the most popular position amongst mathematicians. Mathematical realism says that math is real, that it has an objective existence. It's like stuff. And I don't mean objective like 2 Wheezies plus another 2 Wheezies equals 4 Wheezies regardless of your opinion, but objective like mathematical concepts exist, disembodied in the universe. And as humans with awesome brains, we uncover them and bring them into practical use. New mathematical concepts are like undiscovered species. We just need to find them, and in doing so, add to our set of mathematical knowledge. The anti-realists say that the only reason we have that set of mathematical knowledge is not because we discovered it, but because we created it. They say that math comes from the human brain and nowhere else. And there are a bunch of different variations on this idea, like math is a metaphor, math is a language. My personal favorite is called fictionalism. Fictionalists say that square roots, the derivative of tan x, 42, and all other mathematical concepts are part of a fiction. They are the elements of a story. The story of math in the same way that Dr. No and a car with missiles in it are elements of the story of James Bond. 10 divided by 2 equals 5 is about as true as James Bond ordered his martini shaken, not stirred. Within the construct of the story, it makes perfect sense. But outside the story, 5, 10, James Bond, and his martini don't actually real. What we do is we use the story of math, which is very good and very complete and totally mathematical, good job us, to describe real things which do not themselves contain or perform math. Like, does an unladen European swallow need all of this math in order to travel at 24 miles an hour? No, of course not. And furthermore, your mother was a hamster, and your father smelled of elderberries. Philosopher Alain Badiou says that mathematics is thus a rigorous aesthetic. It tells us nothing of real being, but forges a fiction of intelligible consistency. Now this is a nice, friendly, philosophical conversation until we start to consider one of my favorite implications: ramifications. Like, what exactly is at stake when we're considering the source of mathematics? I mean, I don't want to alarm anybody, but literally everything. For mathematical realists, math is about truth. It is true that when you group 5 of something with another 5 of that something, you have 10 of that something. It is true. We can prove it. So if math and its operations don't exist, are we saying that truth, or a version of it, doesn't exist? Some anti-realists would say that there is only 10 of that something because we are there to count it and perceive it, and that objectively there is no group, no 10, and no mathematical truth? Or maybe it's just math that's at stake. Cognitive linguists Lakoff and Nunez say that humans, because we want to describe, discover, and probe, are great at inventing systems that help us do that. Numbers, operations, even measurements. Lakoff and Nunez say that math is able to model regularities in the universe which are not inherently mathematic, but are modeled and understood through math by humans. If there existed something better than math at explaining and modeling the world, then we'd use that instead.
Sources for all this in the doobly-doo, a word I invented.
Which brings us to the last and I think most important point in this very weird conversation. Seeing as how math is only provable with more math, a tautology arises. The only math which is known by humans is the math which is knowable by humans. It might seem obvious, but it's really important, because mathematical realists believe that beyond the math we currently know, there is more math. They believe in an objective mathematical universe that contains concepts we might one day discover, we might never discover, and for whatever reason might never be able to discover. And in the absence of a direct observation of mathematics, in the same way that a biologist can directly observe cells, mathematical realism boils down to a kind of faith. A faith in a mathematical entity or set of entities which is out there, in the universe, waiting to be discovered, and would be there regardless of if they're human or not. Now, to my ears, the belief in an external mathematical universe that you can't perceive or directly interact with sounds a lot less like science and a lot more like the opposite of science. So does this mean that I think realism and the idea that mathematics exists outside of the human brain is false? I really don't know. Personally, I think anti-realism is more interesting, but if I really knew what was true, I would probably have a Nobel Prize in Physics, or be Braun, the creator of the entire universe. What do you guys think? Does math exist in the universe, or does it come from the human brain?
So, to give a model, biology itself is not a living thing. It's a tool for looking at living things, but there's a difference between the tool and the living things, right? Physics is not a physical object. Like I can have a textbook that's a physical object, but the textbook isn't physics. It's the ideas coded in the words that's physics. So physics isn't a physical object. It's a tool for understanding physical objects. Math is a way to look at relationships between objects, but it's not objects. But because we don't know how to deal with that very well, Nietzsche says fairly accurately, or predicts fairly accurately, we're going to start having faith in science. We're going to start asserting our relationship to math the way that we used to assert our relationship to the absolutes, which is a problem for him because he doesn't like faith very much. So his concern about our religious habits with truth make him very opposed to like faith across the board. He argued that faith in science, that if we treat science like religion, it's going to get weird and ugly and nihilistic. To find meaning in our lives, to find what significance actually is, you have to find something besides science, and religion is not going to work. He suggested culture. He's like, man, look at the Greeks. They had it going on. They understood sorrow, they understood joy, they understood drunkenness, they understood all these things. We could do that too. We could have a great culture, which is where we can find great meaning. We can laugh together, we can cry together, but we can be together. We don't have to appeal to faith. But our dependency on obedience, because we're slaves, is epitomized in our emphasis on faith above reason. Faith for Nietzsche is just a trick to play on the poor and the ignorant. It's a way to get them to be what he called the herd, the sheep. Like you just follow the shepherd, little one. So teaching people to value faith over evidence is the biggest liability to human progress. This is why he's like, okay, you need to stop. This whole party is off the rails. Not only is it teaching people to be willfully ignorant, like if I give you good evidence to change your mind, but you're like, well, I'm going to believe. It's like, okay, well, first you're being willfully ignorant. But second, this idea of faith and that you have to have faith in things is getting in your way of understanding how science works or how the new epistemology works. So consider the present Pray for Paris slogan. You guys have seen this, right? Floating around. Nietzsche would say, interestingly, it took me like a whole page of Google before I found an uncopyrighted version. You know, like they got the little stamps all over them. Wow, you guys turned that into a commodity really quick. But Nietzsche would say that this slogan translates to do nothing for Paris because you think you're powerless. Because for Nietzsche, praying means I'm going to go in my house and do nothing. Or as Hannibal Buress says.
I don't like when people say, I'll pray for you. I'll pray for you. I'll pray for you. You're going to pray for me? So basically you're going to sit at home and do nothing? That's what your prayers are. You doing nothing while I struggle with a situation. So don't pray for me. Make me a sandwich or something. Because I'm very upset right now and I can't make my own sandwiches. So that'd be cool if you made me a sandwich instead of praying. It's very lazy. We don't keep you in our thoughts. With the other bullshit in your head, no. Keep me out of your thoughts. Now here's some of the stuff you talk about. If that's close to what you're thinking about, I don't want to be around that at all. So keep me and my family out of your thoughts unless you're thinking about making us sandwiches.
So you get the point, right? So therefore, he's like, okay, here's the problem that we've got. He's looking at Europe, late 19th century. Christianity, he's going to say, you guys have made the morality of weakness, this slave morality, the defining morality of the era. This is the genealogy. This is how we got to where we are. It's a slave's religion, and there he's being literal. He's like, look, this started with slaves. These were slaves in the Greek, soon-to-be Roman Empire. And it's turned the world into its slave.
I understand the slave morality, but do you think the human brain is like inherently motivated to try to find faith?
Let me shelve my answer to that because Sartre gives a much better answer. So he's going to talk about like how we have bad habits because of the situation that we're in, and that'll I think answer that question a little bit better.
So does he believe that like people grasping onto these absolute truths is because of the existence of faith and religion and stuff? Because like they want to believe in something, and so they want to believe in these absolute things. Like,
Well,
I'm just trying to,
so motivations.
yeah, like why do people hold so tightly onto these absolute truths?
Well, he's gonna look at the human self as entirely constructed. You're just a blank canvas that culture painted itself onto. And so first, the reason that you have these habits is because that's the way you've been trained. You've been conditioned. So for like literally ever, as far as I know and as far as Nietzsche argued, we've had some type of absolute forever. So it's so deeply woven into our conversation that it's very hard to think out of that box. And that's where he is right after Kant. He's like, we're out of the box. We don't have to do this anymore. So basically he's like, the reason you're doing, it's as if I open the prison door and you're just staying in there because it's comfy. You know? And he's like, okay, well, move, get going. And he thinks it's going to take a long time for us to break ourselves of the habit, but generally he's going to say it's part of your cultural conditioning, and he's just trying to get you to not do it. Sartre is going to say that there's other reasons why you have these motivations, largely fear, but he'll give us a better answer.
Do you think those motivations might also tie into the people get some sense of relief thinking that there's an afterlife?
Again, Sartre's going to call this bad faith, in the sense that if I give up my responsibility, if I give up my Dionysian, Apollonian self, then I am relieved of the burden of responsibility. I'm no longer accountable for my life. I am just the victim of a larger story. And Sartre is going to say, well, that's very comforting lie, but that's horrible. Don't live your life that way. And he has a lot to say about that. But he's basically going to say, you're just following this story because you're scared, and this story offers you some comfort.
That's what Neil deGrasse Tyson was saying in that interview, right? He's
Yeah.
like, once you stop.
Once you accept an absolute answer, then you stop asking questions.
Yeah.
And that's where Nietzsche is going to complain about faith. He's like, once you have faith that you have the absolute answer, then you've left the game.
Yeah.
And the game never. Why stop at the 10th step on a staircase that goes forever? So, anyways, our current problem, where we are now, or where we were when Nietzsche was doing his thing, is that Christianity, the Christian morality, the story of how this morality came to us is that this community was an oppressed minority. So like the old turn the other cheek thing. He's like, that in the same way that killing a baby in an Inuit society makes sense. Turning the other cheek, when you're a slave, yeah, that makes, like Hannibal Buress, the comedian we just saw, had this hilarious thing about like, you know, you hear a lot of like African Americans talking about, man, if I got off the boat and they told me to pick cotton, I'd be like, screw you. And he's like, yeah, probably the first thing I said that. And then they're like, okay. It's like he's like, it's not like an inherently evil thing. It made sense at the time. But like say Inuit culture came and colonized America, and we were still killing babies, even though we didn't have to worry about the calorie resource allocation. Nietzsche would say, this is stupid, we don't need to do this anymore. Likewise, this slave morality is like, we outgrew this a long time ago. So it's no longer the case, yet we still hold on to this morality of victimhood. Every time you challenge this worldview, it gets deflected by cries of persecution. That is, oh, I'm being persecuted because I am in a religion that worships a martyr. Well, of course you're going to have a persecution complex if you worship a martyr. That's what martyrs are. So Zarathustra, I'm bouncing back and forth between gay science and Zarathustra. Zarathustra concludes with the message that all people must define their own understanding of the world and not follow any absolute truth. And one of the reasons why Nietzsche is so hard to read, or at least can be hard to read, is because he's desperately trying to get you to not follow him. He's like, don't put me on a pedestal, man. In short, listen to me tell you not to listen to me. Or anybody else. Which is that's a hard thing to say. You know, like, please pay attention to me telling you not to pay attention to me, right? Like, that's a weird argument.
So is he like giving the ideas, but like not telling you not to follow them, but like giving you the ideas?
He's trying to show you how to be free.
Okay.
But if you, okay, so like Thelonious Monk, one of the most unique piano players in the world. If you study Thelonious Monk, like I say, okay, go study Thelonious Monk, and 10 years later I listen to you play the piano, and you play exactly like Thelonious Monk did, I said you failed. You need to play the piano like no one's ever played the piano before, which is what Thelonious Monk did. So he's like, okay, see me, I'm playing free. So go play free. If you play like me, you're just my slave now.
So Nietzsche's trying to totally abolish the whole idea of fate.
Oh yeah, Nietzsche hates it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's his, yeah. Like my favorite bumper sticker from him statement is a casual stroll through a lunatic asylum shows that faith proves nothing at all. Okay, so in the Gay Science, from Zarathustra to the cleaner text, he turns his eye to philosophy itself. He's like, okay, I ripped on philosophy, I ripped on faith and science. I ripped on religion, ripped on faith and science. Now let's rip on philosophy itself. He does a lot of work with like pointing out what he calls unnecessary binary opposites in philosophy. Like if you study if you take an intro to philosophy class, we'll talk about skepticism and certainty, as if those are your only two options. You have to be 100% skeptical or 100% certain. It's like, that's silly. That's an absolute in and of itself. So after like mapping all that out, he makes another big conclusion about philosophy. Much like religion, philosophy is not about truth. Philosophy is hegemonic too. Philosophy is about power. That's why he's trying so hard not to get you to jump on the Nietzsche train, because if you jump on the Nietzsche train, he's like, well, you idiot, now you're following me. Like, did you ever see Life of Brian, Monty Python? This is like this guy gets mistaken for a Messiah, and he keeps trying to get people to stop following him, so he stands and he's got like legions of people that are worshiping him as if he's the Messiah. And he says, don't follow me, you're all individuals. And they all together go, we're individuals! He's like, oh. So that, he's like, okay, philosophy's like that too. It's what we now call hegemony. Whenever you promote ideas as true or false, no matter what your intent was, you're promoting power. So all things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power, not truth. Like, for example, look through the history of philosophy and find the poor minority philosophers. Or the women. Or anybody but the dead white guys. Wow, the dead white guys are so smart. Also, they're in a position in which they can write and be published and blah, 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 blah. Doesn't mean that that group is any smarter than any other group. It means that just they were in a powerful enough position to promote their ideas. So philosophy is interested in giving us insight not into the truth. When you read philosophy, Nietzsche's like, what you're reading is somebody's opinion about the world, which is interesting, but it's somebody's opinion about the world. Go make your own. So everything, therefore, now we're going to move to an essay called Will to Power. Everything, the only thing you really need to keep an eye on is the will to power. Yes, Einstein's got some great things to say, but really what motivates Einstein is that this is the way he wants us to see the world. And again, that's not inherently good or inherently bad, but you need to recognize that the only real mechanism in philosophy or religion or hegemony at all is the will to power. Powerful minds trying to impose their will on the rest of the world to get the rest of the world to see it the way that they do. He called philosophers strong poets. It's like you're just writing like Aristotle just was very persuasive. Wrote very convincing arguments. That doesn't mean there isn't an absolute truth. So they couldn't be any truer or falser than anything else. What you need to do is look at them as more or less persuasive. So Nietzsche Nietzsche recognized very early on, look, language is not purely informative. It's not just me exchanging ideas. It's not just me telling you 2 + 2 = 4. It's performative. It's like the reason I'm saying this right now is because I want you to see Nietzsche the way I see Nietzsche, which is an expression of my will on your brain, which Nietzsche's going to say, yeah, that right there, that dude. Don't listen to him. Or listen to him knowing that he's giving you his perspective. And listen to me, knowing that I'm giving you my perspective and that neither one of us are absolutely right, because there's no such thing. So in particular, philosophy and religion are simply an expression of the author's will. They're talking about how they want you to see the world. So, all you need to focus on is the will to power, and most importantly, recognize your own. Behind all truth, if I ask you what is the capital T truth about whatever, like what's the meaning of life, whatever, the last answer you'll give me will either be your own expression of the will to power or you parroting someone else's expression to the will to power. But in either case, it will be the will to power. So it's like, well, don't look at the answer, look at the motivation behind it. I mean, the answers are cool, but there's more. So whatever you personally call truth, for instance, is just an expression of your will to power, and that's where you declare a particular perspective on reality to be universally true. It's like, that's the habit you need to break.
Is this kind of like the Jane epistemology?
Yeah, very close. Where there is no absolute claim. Nothing's absolutely right and absolutely wrong. The Janes and Kant are both actually in the same neighborhood as far as like how to deal with reality. The Kant thing is really coming to bear. I read an article, slight divergence from Nietzsche for a second. I read a very confusing article this morning about dark matter. I don't quite understand it, but there is, from what I do understand, there might be dark, like you guys know what I mean by dark matter. Here's where Kant becomes relevant to us. Cosmology, at the scale that we, like Kant didn't know that there was anything beyond the solar system, right? But he would have been able to predict that it's very naive of us to assume that we would be able to observe the entire universe with eyes that were evolved to find food on this rock. That is, that when I look up into space, I see huge swaths of nothing. And Kant says that's because there's nothing out there that's relevant to it. There could be huge things out there. And now contemporary astrophysics is telling us, yes, there are huge things that we can't see it, we can't interact with it, we just know it's there because it's got a gravitational pull. Yes, ma'am?
So is it somewhat along the lines of, I heard like a metaphor kind of situation for that, like we can't see what we don't know kind of thing?
Well, it's more like we don't have the, like, we only see a tiny little bit of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Like our eyes just...
Yeah, you can't see it.
Okay.
It's also at a density that we can't, like it could be passing through us right now.
So is it kind of like a dog whistle where we can't hear it at such a high decibel?
Yeah, but except for it's a form of matter. And the only reason that we know it exists is because if we added up everything that has matter as we recognize it in the universe, that would be 5% of what's going on. So like the galaxy doesn't have enough mass in it to hold together, yet it's holding together. So scientists are, okay, there's got to be something we can't see that's holding it together. And the article that I read this morning said that this matter strings, and that there might be a concentration of dark matter behind the moon, or not like literally behind the moon, but in the range of where the moon is, that we could get to some dark matter and figure, like, you know, do whatever you do with it. That's very exciting because if I could, not to be like the crass pragmatist, but if you can figure out a way to turn that into something you can interact with, like a fuel source, warp drive, baby. Like we can just pull on that little string and go and get out of here. So,
oh yeah, so you're saying something about like eyes. Okay, our eyes are trained to find food. And
our eyes we can only see what's in the electromagnetic spectrum that comes through this atmosphere.
Right.
Which is actually a fraction of the universe.
Right. So because astronomers are getting paid to like look at this stuff, they're essentially looking at the stars to get paid to find food.
Well, true, but I'm talking in pure like empirical, like what counts as empirical science is actually too narrow to account for the universe, because what we count as for empirical science is stuff that we can, and it's like, well, the only thing that I can touch and weigh and measure and look at is stuff that's within the electromagnetic spectrum that my eyes are adjusted for and my hands are adjusted for. But there's more. Okay, before we go, real quick. Reality is nothing more than competing wills. That is, it's just a constant struggle for power. And that, it depends on which team you want to cheer for. But Nietzsche is then going to say, okay, so what we need to do is you need to go be free. He praises the free spirits who struggle to free themselves. Get all of the opinions that you inherited as absolutely true, lose it. Learn how to question your instincts. So if the Nietzschean advice, if I come in the room and I'm like, okay, my brothers and sisters, behold the holy and sacred black pen, but beware of the vicious and vile red pen. The first question you should ask is, why would I want you to think this was bad, this is good, this is bad? You can ask yourself whether it's good or bad next. But first ask, why would I want you to think that? Then, when you look at black, whatever your instincts are, ask yourself, why do I have those instincts? Locate yourself historically. So for example, if you were in Louisiana in 1830, you'd be racist. Nietzsche says, ask yourself why you're racist. Ask yourself why you have the reactions that you have, because the reactions that you have are a result of your conditioning. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily good or necessarily bad, but make an active choice. All right, looks like we'll keep on going on the Nietzsche chain next time, and then hopefully we'll get to John Paul. We actually need to talk about atheism too.
Kinsey, did you read that article? It was like they described it as like hair fibers.
Yeah. Like it showed. I saw a picture, and it had. They were making an analogy with light.
Yeah, and it's just like stretching out.
Yeah. And I was just like, I don't understand the density of dark matter, or if they've been able to infer the density, but I'm like, because he said it would be 1 billion times concentrated. I'm like, concentrated compared to what? That doesn't give me anything. But I'm fascinated. I'm like, go figure it out, man. Tell me about it. When you guys get it, let me know.
We're always searching like pretty far away for stuff, but
yeah, if
it's
we
like
could,
right there.
and if we could do something with it,
Yeah.
whoa, that would be huge. That would be like, yeah.
I'll catch you later.
All right, man. See you.
Have a good one.
See you. See you.
Thanks for the class.
Oh, what up, Lou? Did you stick around for that lecture?
Yeah, I did.
I was like, you'll hear at the very beginning me going, oh, Gabe forgot his phone. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right.